Australia's relations with critical neighbour Indonesia have been going through a rocky period during the first 2 months of the Abbott government, partly affected by the Asylum program launched by the government and also partly affected by those claims that the Australian Embassy in Jakarta has been used as a base for spying. A unique, or at least different aspect to much of what we've been hearing comes from Professor Hikmahanto Juwana, a former Dean of the Law School at the University of Indonesia in Jakarta, an expert on international relations. He joins Breaking Politics today. Professor, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me in your program, Tim.
Professor, first, how would you describe the state of relations between Indonesia and Jakarta at the moment?
Well, the state of relations at the moment is becoming worsened, and probably this is because the Indonesian government need to adjust with the Australian government under Prime Minister Abbott, and of course Prime Minister Abbott also need to make adjustment with the Indonesian government. Why I said this is because after the inauguration of Tony Abbott as the Prime Minister, of course, here in Indonesia, we are hearing about the issue of combating illegal immigrants from the Prime Minister's Abbott plan. And I think most of Indonesian, especially the elite and also the agencies that has responsibility, does not like what the plan of Prime Minister Abbott. And because of this, the relation has been not as good as previously.
What aspects of Tony Abbott's policy on asylum seekers particularly upsets or worries Indonesian authorities, Professor?
Three things. One is the quote-unquote unilateral policy of Abbott by saying that it is the responsibility of Indonesian government because the illegal immigrants are coming from Indonesia. Secondly, on how Prime Minister see this issue, because in Indonesia, we see this as an international issue. It is not a problem of Indonesia, and we understand also that it is not a problem of Australia. But we need to look at this as an international issue, and before Prime Minister Abbott take over the government, the Indonesian government has successful in making the Jakarta Declaration at that time with Kevin Rudd's government, and also government from where these asylum seekers are coming from. And the third thing, I think a lot of Indonesians are offended when Tony Abbott said that his program will amount to 420 million Australian dollars, and then he will pay our village wardens and buy boats, those kind of thing, which many Indonesians think this is infringing our sovereignty. So those three issues.
Professor, you say you've learned some new information on Indonesia's plans with regard to immigration detention centres today. Explain what you know and how this might play into the Indonesia-Australia relationship. Well,
what I just today from the media in India is that the government is going to decrease the state budgets for the detention center by the immigration office. And of course, in the newspaper, they stated that the illegal immigrants coming to Indonesia or returning from Australia to Indonesia has been increased. However, the budget is being decreased. So I think the government now realized that more budget should be addressed for our poor people, the welfare of our poor people here, rather than spending or allocating to the illegal immigrants coming to Indonesia.
What does that reduction of funding, do you think, mean in terms of the flow of asylum seekers towards Australia and through Indonesia?
Well, I think Indonesia, from here on, will not take the responsibility of these illegal immigrants when the Australian authorities is trying to hand over to Indonesia. Because previously, when these people went to sea and then they will try to, by themselves make damage to their boats or to their ships, and then they will call the Australian authorities, and then the Australian authorities will come, and then they will contact Indonesian authorities, and then hand over to Indonesian authorities. That I don't think will no longer happen, because Indonesians are aware, once they brought these illegal immigrants or asylum seekers back to our soil, then it is the Indonesian government who has to pay everything. They have to take care of the welfare of these people. And if we do not do that, then there's going to be international criticism. And of course, we said that, we have a lot of poor people here in Indonesia, and then we need to take care of them. And we cannot, of course, allocate more money to the illegal immigrant, especially when Australia have this turn back boat policy, and also the sovereign borders operations. I mean, because Tony Abbott has publicly announced this issue, and then we now understand that it is not to our favor to have these illegal immigrants in our soil.
So how sustainable, Professor, is it for Australia to continue on with the Tony Abbott policy that we've been carrying on now for a couple of months?
Well, the last incidents where there's a standoff, and then the Prime Minister, sorry, it was not the Prime Minister, but I think it was a Minister, Scott Morrison, told the Australian authorities to bring the illegal immigrants, instead of returning to Indonesia, bring it to Christmas Island and then send it to Papua New Guinea. To Indonesian government, this is a precedent, meaning that if you have illegal immigrants and then you rescue them and then put in your ships, then you don't have to return them to Indonesia, because their intention, the illegal immigrants' intention, is going to Australia. So it is going to be the responsibility of Australia to take care of them. And you have to also consider that it is in Australian ships. And of course, we understand that Australia is a party to the 1951 Refugee Convention. So it is up to them to take care of these people instead of us, Indonesia. And bear in mind that it was not the Indonesian authorities who these asylum seekers are calling for help. It is the Australian authorities they are calling.
Do you ever see Prime Minister Tony Abbott's plan of tow back the boats to Indonesia working long term?
No, I don't think so. I think the government of Tony Abbott has to change its policy if they want to work with Indonesia. The policy needs to not be unilateral, and it should not be hostile to Indonesia and also infringing Indonesian sovereignty. So by this I meant we have to work together. The Jakarta Declaration that was proposed by our president, and then it was agreed, I think that is the best way, because we look at the issue as an international issue. It is going to be there's going to be an involvement from various countries and also the United Nations. And of course, there's going to be a bear of course, not only from our side, but from other sides, for example, the United Nations or to the Australian government.
There was talk this week of Indonesia seeking to reduce the sea area, its coastal sea area, over which it has responsibility for search and rescue. What is actually going on there, Professor, and why is Indonesia moving in that direction?
Again, because it was sparked by Tony Abbott's policy, and because it was announced publicly when he was campaigning, and then many Indonesian public realized this problem, and we dislike that problem. And I think the government currently is trying to reflect the displease of our public and the anger of our public to Abbott's policy. So by, of course, not offending Australia, the government is trying to reduce, the scope of search and rescue. And, I mentioned at one point that if the Australian government would want to help our search and rescue agency, Basarnas, by giving them proper equipment or incentive, then it has to go to state budget. It may not go directly to the Basarnas, because then if that is happening, then I've criticized that Basarnas can be seen as a paid agent by Australian authorities. So this, I think, needs to be restructured, and I think it is right for the government to evaluate their cooperation on this issue with Australia.
Professor, finally, how much of the current dip in Australia-Indonesia relations is down to these allegations of spying from the Australian Embassy in Jakarta, in part on behalf of the United States? Or is that, do you think, a separate or not so important issue?
Well, it is an important issue here in Indonesia. Public is outraged that they found out that the Australian and the US is spying on us. And the fact that Australian embassy is have this equipment, the spying equipment there. So public is very upset. Unfortunately, we do not see the response, the proper response by the government, especially the president, on this issue. However, probably the president is doing the Javanese way. Probably he is not angry with Australia openly, but he may be very upset, with the fact that Australia is spying on us. And the way he attacked that is by having this issue of asylum seekers. I mean, I cannot tell, exactly, but if I'm putting in the president's shoes and I'm from Java, I would retaliate that kind of thing with the policy of not cooperating with Australia in the asylum seekers issues.
Professor, last question. There is an Indonesian presidential election not too far away. Do you believe relations with Australia are likely to get easier beyond that election or harder?
Well, it all depends on how Prime Minister Abbott is going to lay down his policy on Indonesia. Of course, we understand that Abbott tell public that Indonesia is an important country, but the problem is important to what sense? If it's important to do the quote-unquote Australian dirty work, then we don't think, or Indonesia don't think that we are so important to Australia. So I think any government in Indonesia will look closely on how the policy of Prime Minister Abbott toward us. However, you have to bear in mind that it is not an issue of people to people between Indonesian people and Australian people. I think the people to people relation has to be preserved, and it has to be increased in that cooperation and this and that. However, we need to be critical with the government's policy.
Professor Hikmahanto Juwana, you've been generous with your time. Thank you for coming on Breaking Politics today.
Thank you very much. Thank you again. Hope for your success.